moments in life when a seemingly harmless decision can set us on unexpected paths. A choice that seemed logical, an ordinary situation, until something happens and everything changes. That's what happened on that trip. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to experience something that would stay with me forever. The person sharing this story prefers to remain anonymous. Good evening, Dom. I decided to share this story because, despite the years that have passed, I still think about it a lot. I never imagined something like this could happen to me, and I believe that sharing this account might serve as a warning to others. I'd like to keep my identity anonymous because this is a sensitive matter, and I don't want any notoriety from it. When it all happened, I chose not to give interviews or reveal my identity to ensure my family's safety and preserve my privacy. However, I believe telling this story might be useful, encouraging you to be more attentive and cautious in your daily lives. It's been a few years since this happened, back when the platform was still relatively unknown. I was younger and frequently traveled for work, whether to other cities or even different countries, giving courses and providing consultancy for the company I worked for at the time. My wife, who usually traveled with me, decided not to come this time because she was pregnant with our first child. She opted to stay at her mother's house, where she would receive the necessary care. Since my mother-in-law has allergies, she couldn't take our dog, Billy, so I decided to bring him with me. During my travels, I used to rent accommodations through the same platform, with the expenses covered by the company. Up until then, I had never faced any issues. However, this time, I made the mistake of choosing a property whose host had no reviews. Even though I knew this could be risky, I decided to take the chance since I had never had any trouble before. Besides, it was the only place that allowed pets and was close to where I needed to work. I arrived in the afternoon at a compact ground floor apartment that initially seemed comfortable. There was a backyard, which I liked since it would be ideal for my dog to play and relieve himself. The host sent me a message explaining where to find the keys. I never met him in person, as he wasn't there when I arrived and never showed up during my stay. Our communication was limited to a few basic instructions sent through the platform's chat. While he wasn't exactly friendly, he wasn't rude either. He was direct and to the point, unlike other hosts who tend to be more accommodating or offer to help with any issues. At the time, I didn't mind. I just assumed it was his personality. The problem started on the first night. When I let Billy out into the yard before bed, he bolted and started barking intensely and desperately, alternating with a whimper that sounded like a cry for attention. I found it strange, but didn't think much of it at the time. Since we had arrived, he had already been behaving unusually, insisting on staying by the door leading to the yard and scratching at it to go out. However, I hadn't had time to take him outside earlier, so I only let him out at night. Despite his unusual behavior, I quickly brought him back inside, worried he might disturb any neighbors, although most of the nearby apartments were vacant and for sale. Once inside, he remained restless, fixated on the door leading to the yard. He kept scratching and barking, clearly distressed. The only solution I found was to put him in the travel crate we always used during trips. Even then, he stayed agitated all night. whining and barking nonstop. I barely got any sleep. It was odd, because he had never acted like that before. He was always a calm, obedient, and well-trained dog. Something was deeply unsettling him, but I had no idea what it could be. The next day, I left for work, keeping him locked inside the apartment, away from the yard, to prevent him from barking like he had the night before. When I returned, I took him out for a walk and to do his business on the street, but I decided it was best not to let him back into the backyard. Something about that space seemed to be the source of his agitation. Later that night, while trying to sleep, I heard a sound that made me sit up immediately. Someone crying outside, in the yard. The sound was so clear, it seemed incredibly close. Billy, who had been quiet until then, started barking again, this time at the bedroom window facing the yard. My heart pounded. I got up and cautiously opened the blinds to see what was going on. There was no one there. Even so, my dog's barking seemed to confirm what I had heard. I spent hours trying to calm him down before, finally exhausted, I managed to fall asleep again. The next day, still tired from the sleepless night, I went to work. It was my last day in that city, and I couldn't wait to leave. I didn't feel comfortable there after everything that had happened. But as if fate had one more surprise in store, something even more terrifying happened before I could get away. It was past 11 at night. Billy and I were asleep when a loud noise startled me awake. Someone was pounding on the front door. I jumped up, startled, and looked out the window near the entrance. Outside, bright lights shone, and 3 police officers stood there. I immediately opened the door, confused and worried, and asked what was going on. They questioned what I was doing in the apartment. I explained that I had rented the place for 3 days and showed them the app on my phone to prove my stay. After checking my information, the officers apologized for involving me, but said they needed to clear the premises. There was a search and seizure warrant for the apartment. The owner was under investigation for multiple homicides, and they needed to search the property before he could flee. At that moment, it felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. Their words hit me like a punch, and I felt trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Unfortunately, it was all real. Without wasting time, I gathered my things and left the apartment with Billy. Before leaving, I mentioned my dog's behavior to the police. I told them how he had spent the entire time restless and barking at the backyard. I didn't know if it would be useful, but I felt it was important to share. The truth was that the man had buried at least 7 people in the yard, all reduced to skeletal remains. He was a serial killer who had been operating in the area for years, wanted by the police for a long time. He always followed the same pattern in his crimes. According to investigators and specialists who worked on the case, he was an intelligent man with substantial wealth, someone above suspicion. I learned more about the case because, after everything, I became obsessed with understanding what had happened. I researched every detail about him and his crimes, trying to process the fact that I had stayed in the very place where his victims had been buried. Even now, it's hard to believe. He later confessed to the police that he frequently rented out the property specifically to keep a steady flow of guests, preventing any suspicion from arising. This experience left a deep mark on me. I became much more cautious and vigilant because you never know what might be lurking behind seemingly harmless situations. It's never too much to say. Always be careful. There are many dangerous people out there. This is a story that transformed my life and brought lessons I will never forget. I'm sure that anyone who has been through something similar involving witchcraft will identify with what I experienced. My name is Christina, and it all happened a few years ago when I lived in the city of Querétaro in Mexico. At that time, I was struggling to fulfill a big dream, opening a small pastry shop. However, what happened not only shook my faith in the people around me, but also showed me how devastating envy can be. Ever since I was a child, I've always loved baking. The afternoons in the kitchen with my mother, creating cakes and cookies, were the most special moments of my life. As I grew up, I decided to turn that passion into a profession. It wasn't easy at all. I saved money for months, gave it my all, and managed to open the pastry shop. I faced doubts and criticism, including those from Carol, a longtime friend. Carol and I met in our teenage years, and despite our differences, our friendship continued. I was always the optimistic one, while she saw everything with distrust and negativity. Carol had tried to start her own business several times, whether it was a clothing store or a small cafe, but none of them ever succeeded. She blamed everything, fate, other people, although it was obvious that her discouraging attitude overshadowed even the best opportunities. When my pastry shop opened, Carol showed her support. She brought flowers on opening day and congratulated me. But soon, I began to notice comments that sounded strange. I hope everything goes well, even with so much competition. Another time, she mentioned that my shop wasn't in a very favorable location. I thought she was just being honest and didn't pay much attention. Over time, however, her words started to sound like disguised criticism. Before long, the pastry shop prospered. The whole neighborhood loved my products. Event orders started coming in, and my income increased. It was a huge accomplishment for me, but it also brought something unexpected: Carol's envy. One afternoon, while I was working on a large order, Carol showed up out of the blue. She was anxious and seemed bothered. "I don't know how you do it, Christina. It seems like everything goes right for you. Sometimes I think I wasn't born lucky." She tried to smile, but her eyes told a different story. I tried to comfort her, explaining that success takes effort and patience, but the look on her face left me uneasy. Soon after, strange things started happening. Orders were delayed for no reason. The oven began turning off on its own, and some customers complained about the taste of the cakes, even though I used the same ingredients and recipes. I thought these were normal hiccups at first, but the incidents became more and more peculiar. One night, while I was cleaning the kitchen, I found ashes in a circular shape near the back door. I had no idea how they got there, but a disturbing feeling came over me. A few days later, a neighbor came into the pastry shop looking worried. "Christina, do you know anyone who might be jealous of you? I'm asking because I've seen strange things around here at night." When she said that, my mind immediately jumped to Carol and her behavior, but I refused to believe a friend could act so cruelly. However, the problems persisted. One day, when I opened the pastry shop, I found a small red cloth bag filled with dried herbs, pins, and something that looked like a tuft of hair. A chill ran down my spine, and I realized I needed help. A neighbor suggested I seek out Dona Roberta, a woman known for dealing with negative energies. Without hesitation, I went to her house with the little bag. The moment she saw its contents, she frowned and threw everything into the fire. "This is bad news, Christina. Someone consumed by envy is trying to harm you. We need to cleanse your pastry shop and protect it before things get worse." That same afternoon, Dona Roberta came to my shop. She lit incense, placed candles in the corners, and murmured prayers I didn't understand, but they brought a certain sense of relief. Before leaving, she gave me a vial of holy water to use at the entrance every night and an amulet to carry with me. Even so, the strange incidents did not stop. One night, after closing the shop, I felt as if someone was watching me. Looking out the window, I saw a shadow that quickly disappeared among the trees. My heart pounded, and the first person who came to mind was Carol. A few days later, I decided to confront her. I invited her out for coffee and, without beating around the bush, asked if she knew anything about the problems at the pastry shop. Her reaction was unsettling, a cold smile and words that cut like a knife. "Maybe your luck isn't as good as it seems. Not everything you have is that perfect." Vague as they were, her words and demeanor confirmed my suspicions. I spoke again with Dona Roberta, who told me it wouldn't be easy to undo the work of envy, but she was willing to help. That night, we began a more intense ritual, not only to protect the pastry shop, but also to guard my own energy. It was then that I realized just how far Carol was willing to go to sabotage my happiness. After this conversation, my suspicion only grew stronger. Carol seemed to avoid direct details, but her demeanor and cynical smile spoke louder than any words. I decided not to push her, but my intuition told me she had everything to do with the troubles plaguing my business. The following days were filled with anxiety and frustration. The ingredients I bought spoiled quickly. Customers began canceling orders without explanation, and the atmosphere in the shop felt weighed down by an oppressive energy. I went back to see Dona Roberta, begging for a definitive solution. She agreed to perform a more intense spiritual cleansing, but warned me it could bring difficult truths to light. If someone is behind this, the energy will return to that person, and they will be revealed. I was ready to face anything to regain my peace. The cleansing took place the next evening, after the shop closed. Dona Roberta lit black and white candles, drew a circle of salt on the floor, and recited prayers while incense filled the air. The tension grew as she advanced in the ritual. At a certain point, the atmosphere became heavy, as if something were resisting expulsion. Suddenly, one of the black candles went out on its own. Dona Roberta stopped and looked at me seriously. "This confirms what I suspected. Someone close to you cast this work. Now, we need to find out who it is." She asked me to bring anything that might be connected to Carol or to anyone else who frequented the shop. I remembered the times Carol showed up unannounced, with that fake smile and seemingly harmless comments that now felt charged with hidden intentions. The next day, while searching the pastry shop, I found something that made my blood run cold. A golden chicken-shaped pendant hidden behind a decoration. It wasn't mine, and it couldn't belong to any customer. I took it immediately to Donna Roberta, who examined it carefully. This was placed here as an anchor for negative energy. Whoever put it here knew exactly what they were doing. I think you already have an idea of who it might be. Her voice carried both concern and resolve. Although everything pointed to Carol, it was still hard to accept she would do something so low. I decided to confront her again. We arranged to meet at a cafe, and after a few minutes of small talk, I pulled the pendant out of my purse and placed it on the table. Carol, I found this in the pastry shop. Do you know anything about it? For a brief moment, her face betrayed surprise. Her eyes widened, but she quickly composed herself. And what does that have to do with me? Anyone could have left it there. Maybe you're just imagining things. She tried to change the subject, but her defensive stance said more than her words. I realized she would never admit to anything. I decided I didn't need her confession. I went back to Donna Roberta's house, and she prepared a new, even more intense ritual. This time, she advised me to release any feelings of hurt or fear during the ceremony. It was exhausting, but by the end, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. From that moment on, things started to change. The atmosphere in the pastry shop became light and welcoming. The equipment went back to working flawlessly, and customers returned with enthusiasm, praising the products. However, something curious happened to Carol. A mutual friend told me she began experiencing inexplicable events at home. Lights flickering on their own, mirrors fogging up for no reason, and a constant feeling of being watched. Soon after, a project she was trying to launch failed, and many of the people close to her drifted away. Then, one day, Carol showed up at my pastry shop. She looked worn out, with pronounced dark circles under her eyes and an expression of sheer desperation. "Christina, I need to talk to you." I invited her in, and after a long silence, she finally admitted, "Yes, I was the one who left those objects at your shop. I couldn't deal with you being happy and successful while I just kept failing. I thought that by disrupting your luck, things would change for me, but everything spun out of control." She confessed through tears, revealing that she had gone to someone to perform witchcraft, but it had all backfired on her. Despite the pain and the hurt, I could see Carol was reaping the consequences of her actions. I suggested she seek help to cleanse her energy, but I made it clear that our friendship was over. The betrayal had left a deep mark, impossible to erase. As the days went by, peace was restored. The pastry shop became even more successful, and I emerged from this experience with a valuable lesson about people and the energies around us. Although Carol is now part of my past, her story remains a constant reminder. Envy can be powerful, but it will never surpass dedication and the purity of true intentions. I live in a small house in a quiet and pleasant neighborhood. My workspace is upstairs, in a compact room where I set up my desk by the window facing the front of the house. I've always liked keeping it open to enjoy the fresh air or watch the street on nice days. It was early autumn, so the window stayed open almost all day. One day, while working around noon, I noticed something through the window. A man was standing at the end of my driveway. He didn't seem to be just passing by or tying his shoelaces, nothing like that. He just stood there, motionless, staring at my house. I wasn't sure if he could see me through the window, but after a few seconds, he walked away. I found it strange, but I didn't think too much about it and went back to work. Every now and then, I glanced outside, but since nothing else happened, I let it go. The next day, everything was going as usual. I had a lot of work to do, including several video meetings with colleagues. During one of these calls, I got distracted and looked out the window again. And there he was, the same man, in the same spot, staring at the house just like the day before. This time, a chill ran down my spine. It was much more unsettling. Why was he there again? I kept watching him long enough for one of my colleagues in the meeting to notice my uneasiness. "Is everything okay?" he asked. I said yes, and tried to focus on the conversation again, but my eyes kept drifting back to the window. He stood there for a minute, and when I looked again, he was gone. The rest of the day dragged on. I couldn't stop thinking about that man, standing at the entrance to my house. As soon as I finished work, I went outside to check the spot where he had been. There was nothing unusual. However, I realized that from where he had stood, he had a perfect view of my office window, which had been open. That meant he could see me while I worked. I went back inside, made dinner, and later talked to my brother on the phone. I told him what had happened, and he also thought it was strange, but said it was probably nothing to worry about. After that, I tried to relax by watching TV. Later that night, around 9 o'clock, with the TV volume low, I heard something outside. It sounded like footsteps. I got up suddenly and moved toward the front door. The footsteps came closer, stopped for a moment, and then started moving away. I rushed to the door and looked through the peephole. I saw only a figure walking away toward the street. I quickly opened the door as soon as he disappeared. That's when I noticed a note stuck to the outside. It had only one sentence written on it. "Fred, open the door." I wasn't just confused. I was completely terrified. How did they know my name? What did that note mean? The person hadn't even knocked on the door or waited long enough for me to answer. Not that I would have dared to open it. That was enough to make me call the police. 2 officers came to my house and I explained everything that had happened. Unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do. They took note of the report and told me to call again if anything else happened. That didn't bring me any relief. That night I stayed up late. I lay in bed, motionless, unable to sleep. My mind kept replaying everything. The man watching my house, the disturbing note. When the clock showed just before 2 in the morning, I heard knocking on the front door. The sound echoed through the silent house, freezing me in place. The silence that followed was almost unbearable until the knocking came again. My heart pounded. I immediately grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The police told me they would send officers as quickly as possible, but the knocking continued as I waited. The sound was disturbingly steady, neither louder nor faster, just rhythmic and insistent. As I walked through the house, still on the phone with the dispatcher, I was told that officers would arrive in 2 minutes. That's when I noticed a longer pause between the knocks. 15 seconds, then 30, then an entire minute without a sound. When the officers finally arrived, there was no one at the door. Once again, they had arrived too late. I explained what had happened, and this time, they seemed to take the situation a little more seriously. However, there still wasn't much they could do, besides promising to patrol the area for the next 2 weeks. Weeks passed, and the man never appeared again, neither at the entrance of my house nor standing at the end of the sidewalk, at least not that I noticed. It's been a few months since then, and there have been no more signs of him. Even so, the memory still haunts me. I keep thinking about that terrifying note asking me to open the door and the knocking in the dead of night. It's simply unsettling, and the thought that he might come back still lingers in my mind. I don't know what he wanted, who he was, or if he's really gone for good. My name is Carlos. Some time ago, I decided to rent an Airbnb with my parents so we could travel to a small village. The reason? My brother's wedding was going to take place there. We arrived a few days early to help him with the preparations and also to support my future sister-in-law. The house we stayed in wasn't very big. It had 2 floors and was charming, decorated in the typical style of that lively and colorful place, very characteristic of a picturesque village. I remember that we arrived in the middle of the night, and exhausted, we went straight to bed. We needed to recover our energy to face the days of preparation ahead. That night, everything seemed peaceful, or at least no one mentioned anything unusual, since we were all dead tired. The next day, we left early to visit the venue, finalize details with the florist, and take care of other tasks. To be honest, I found it all a bit tedious. I never had the patience for anything related to decoration and logistics. Noticing this, my mother suggested that I take a walk around the village and return home only in the evening. I immediately accepted the idea. By late afternoon, around 5 o'clock, I went out to explore, but I soon regretted it. The heat was unbearable, and the sun was too strong for a stroll. I decided to head back to the Airbnb, take a shower, order some food, and rest. As soon as I arrived, I went straight to the bathroom. It was almost 6 in the evening. While I was showering, I heard noises coming from downstairs. I thought it was my parents returning, although I found it strange, since they still had a lot to do and had planned to have dinner out. I called out to them a few times, but there was no response. I stepped out of the bathroom with just a towel wrapped around me and went downstairs to check. The house was empty. There was no sign of anyone. That left me puzzled, but I carried on with my plans. I got dressed, ordered food through an app, and turned on the TV in my room to watch a series while I waited. Not even 5 minutes had passed since I lay down when I heard the noises again coming from downstairs. This time, it sounded like wheels, like someone pedaling or pushing something heavy, maybe a cart. That sound unsettled me. I lowered the volume on the TV to listen more carefully. Without a doubt, it was coming from something old, with that characteristic creaking noise. I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my pocket knife, which I always carry, and went downstairs again to investigate. Once again, there was no one. The house remained just as before, practically unfurnished except for the essentials. Nothing that could explain the sound of wheels. I went back to my room, still confused, and tried to focus on my series again. A few minutes later, I received a notification that my food had been delivered. I rushed downstairs. It was already around 8 o'clock, and the sky was starting to darken. As soon as I opened the door, I saw the delivery man already getting on his motorcycle to leave. I called out, letting him know I was the one who placed the order. He responded without hesitation. I already handed it to the lady in the wheelchair. I stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to process what he had just said. I looked around the yard, hoping to see someone, but it was completely empty. I asked the delivery man who he was talking about, and he replied, "An elderly woman in a wheelchair." She opened the door, took the food without saying anything, and closed it right away. My face must have gone pale because he asked me if I was okay. I nodded quickly, thanked him, and let him go. As soon as he left, I searched the entire house, including the small backyard, which was more like a narrow corridor. I found no one. When I entered the kitchen, I saw the bag of food sitting on the table. A shiver ran through my entire body. I ran upstairs to grab my phone and call my parents. I didn't want to scare them, so I just asked where they were so I could meet them. They told me they were at the restaurant, already asking for the check and getting ready to return. While waiting, I locked myself in my room. I turned on the TV, trying to shake off the fear, but it was useless. The sound of creaking wheels still echoed through the house, and now I was sure it was a wheelchair. More than that, I knew it wasn't someone alive. When I finally heard my parents' voices as they arrived, I ran downstairs. I told them everything that had happened. I don't know if they believed me, but I begged them to let us move to a hotel. They refused, reminding me that the stay was already paid for the entire week. My hope vanished. But that same night, my mother changed her mind. It happened when we woke up, startled by a scream coming from downstairs. I rushed down the stairs with my father ahead of me, shouting, "What happened?" We reached the kitchen and found my mother pale, almost crying, with an expression of pure terror. She said she had come downstairs to get some water and saw an elderly woman in a wheelchair passing through the back corridor. The door was open, clearly revealing the outside. My father and I immediately went to check, but as expected, there was no one there. My mother was shaken, saying she couldn't sleep in that house anymore. At that moment, we decided to leave. We rushed out without even informing the host. The next day, I contacted her to explain that we wouldn't be staying any longer and to thank her for the accommodation. The host seemed uneasy, insisting on meeting us in person, probably worried about the review we might leave on the app. My mother agreed to see her, but our decision to leave was final. When the host arrived, it was the first time we had seen her. She was a young woman, maybe around 35, very polite. She wanted to understand why we were leaving early and asked us to be honest, mentioning that the previous guests had also left before the end of their reservation. My mother told her everything that had happened. The host was shocked. She revealed that the previous tenants had also reported the presence of an elderly woman in a wheelchair. Then she told us the truth. The house had belonged to her grandmother, who had passed away there. After inheriting the property, she decided to rent it out, since she lived with her own family in another house. She explained that she had barely had any contact with her grandmother, as the old woman had cut ties with her mother when she was still a child. According to her mother, the elderly woman had a difficult temperament, a truly bitter person, which justified the family's estrangement. The woman had died alone in that house, the victim of a heart attack. The host told us she was surprised to inherit the property, as she had rarely seen her grandmother, and she had no other living relatives. It seemed the old woman had been very lonely. She shared all of this with us, apparently trying to prevent a negative review. Maybe that's why we hadn't seen any bad comments about the house before renting it. After all, the host was extremely friendly, and many people seemed to want to help her. She confessed that, at that moment, renting out the property was her only source of income. I won't say whether I left a bad review or not. My goal is simply to share this story, which had a huge impact on me at the time. To this day, just thinking about it gives me chills, knowing that the presence of that elderly woman is still there, trapped in the house. I spent time alone with her, and it was an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone. As for the review, I'll let you imagine what my decision was. A few years ago, my partner and I decided to plan a special trip to celebrate my birthday. We chose a destination by the sea with the warm tropical climate we had been longing for, since we live in a predominantly cold place. She found an apartment on Airbnb right by the beach, affordable, and equipped with everything we needed. The fact that an elderly woman managed the property made her feel even more confident. On the scheduled day, we set off full of excitement. The host had already sent us all the detailed instructions via message, explaining that she wouldn't be able to greet us due to prior commitments. That wasn't a problem for us. The information was clear, and everything seemed in order. When we arrived, we were impressed by the size of the place. It was much more spacious than we had imagined. The decor was simple, but that didn't bother us. All we needed was a comfortable place to rest. On the first night, exhausted, we quickly fell asleep. However, I was suddenly awakened in the middle of the night by a strange sound. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. My partner was still sleeping soundly, and I didn't want to wake her. I got up to get a glass of water, and as I walked toward the kitchen, I heard another noise coming from the upper floor. My heart pounded. I rushed upstairs, worried about my partner, since she was sleeping up there. I checked our bedroom first, then the other room, but I found nothing unusual. She remained peacefully asleep, completely unaware of what had happened. The next day, I decided not to mention what I had experienced, not wanting to cause unnecessary worry or ruin our day. But as we were enjoying the beach, she surprised me. "I need to tell you something, but I want you to promise you won't worry. Since we arrived, I've had this feeling that someone is watching us all the time. It's an eerie sensation I felt the moment I walked in." I was speechless. I asked her why she hadn't told me before, and she explained that she didn't want to spoil the trip. I suggested finding another place or even a hotel, but she refused, saying we had already paid for 4 nights and didn't want to spend more money. So we decided to ignore it. That night, I stayed by her side the entire time, never leaving her alone in the apartment. The atmosphere felt heavy, and even I started sensing a strange presence. And as if that wasn't enough, the noises returned. In the dead silence of the night, slow, distinct footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. I searched every room again, and just like before, no one was there. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, trying to protect her from something I couldn't even understand. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I heard crying. It was muffled, but very close, as if coming from the next room. My body froze. I went to check, but once again, there was no one. Then I decided to investigate the source of the sound. I followed the noise to the wall behind the bed's headboard, which theoretically led to the exterior of the building, but to my complete shock, I was mistaken. Upon closer inspection, I noticed small holes at the top of the wooden wall. Careful not to make any noise, I climbed onto the bed and leaned toward one of them. Peering through, I saw a worn-out mattress and a single light bulb glowing. I couldn't see anyone, but it became clear that there was a hidden room inside the apartment. The most terrifying part? Someone had been living there while we were staying. When my partner stepped out of the bathroom, I gestured for her to stay silent. We grabbed our most important belongings in a hurry and bolted out of the apartment. She looked terrified and confused. Once we were outside, I told her everything. As soon as she heard it, she started crying, overwhelmed with fear, because she had felt all along that someone had been watching us. We called the police, who arrived quickly, as it was a tourist area with constant surveillance. I reported everything that had happened, and the officers entered the apartment. They discovered that the entrance to the hidden room was behind a wardrobe in one of the rooms. Inside, they found a man around 45 years old, disheveled, with a long beard and barely dressed. We tried to contact the supposed host, but she never responded. Furious, we reported the incident both to the police and the rental platform. That's when we discovered that the man found inside was actually the real owner of the property. He had been using his mother's identity. She lived with his sister in another city, completely unaware of his actions. The apartment, which he had inherited, was being rented out so he could spy on the guests. The man was arrested after authorities also found illegal weapons and prohibited substances on the premises. The experience left us deeply traumatized. Since then, we only stay in hotels or accommodations with a large number of trustworthy reviews. This happened a few years ago, and today the platform enforces stricter security measures to prevent similar incidents. Even so, we learned that it's crucial to always stay on guard. One morning during my elementary school years, maybe in 3rd or 4th grade, I was suddenly woken up by my mother. She had overslept, and since she was always the one to wake me up, that meant I had also slept longer than I should have. There was no way I could get ready in time to catch the bus. My school started at 8 in the morning, and the bus usually passed by around 7. But at that moment, it was already 6:40, and I was still in my pajamas without even having breakfast yet. Given the situation, my mother decided that she would take me to school herself that day, which would give me more time to get ready. I was sitting at the dining table, still in my pajamas and eating breakfast, when the clock showed it was close to 6:50. That's when we heard the sound of the school bus stopping in front of our house. About 10 minutes earlier than usual, my mother took a quick peek out the door on that grayish morning, waved at the driver to keep going, and came back inside. But the bus didn't leave. A few moments later, someone knocked on the door. My mother answered and found a man dressed as a school bus driver. He explained that he was filling in for the regular driver who had supposedly called in sick. He also mentioned that he had arrived early because he wanted to get ahead of schedule since he wasn't very familiar with the route. My mother replied that she would be taking me to school herself that day since we had woken up late. The man insisted, saying he could wait a few minutes since he was ahead of schedule. Still, my mother stood her ground. She told him I would take longer to get ready and asked him to continue his route. Frustrated, the man turned away, got on the bus, and left. I kept eating my breakfast calmly, still in no rush to get dressed. When the clock struck exactly 7, another bus stopped in front of our house. My mother, finding it all very strange, went outside to talk to the driver. When she came back, she looked extremely shaken, but didn't say anything right away. She just asked me to finish eating and get dressed. At the time, I didn't understand what had happened, but years later, she told me. That second bus was driven by the regular driver and was full of the kids who always rode the same route as me. Confused, my mother asked him about the substitute and mentioned that he had supposedly called in sick. Sick? Me? I never called in or missed work. There's no substitute driver on my route, he replied. At that point, the driver became alarmed and immediately contacted the bus station. He told my mother to go back inside and call the police. She did without telling me anything at the time. Later, we found out that there was no record of any substitute driver for that route. The person who showed up that morning most likely had other intentions. If my mother hadn't overslept that day, I might have never made it to school or back home. It happened during my first year of high school. My name is Mateus, and the town where I lived was small and honestly felt quite outdated compared to other places. Surrounded by dense woods, the buildings were scattered, far apart from one another. My house was isolated, right in the middle of all the greenery. My parents owned a considerable piece of land, and my father, along with my grandfather, built the house we lived in. There was no paved road or official entrance, just a dirt path. Because of this, school buses never stopped near our house. To catch the bus, I had to walk about 1,000 meters to a friend's house or make the entire journey to school on foot. Most of the time, I chose to walk the whole way. On a day that seemed like any other, I was walking down the trail from my house, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest, when I saw a car parked further ahead. It didn't belong to my parents or anyone I knew. The vehicle was just sitting there on the path. which led only to our house. Something extremely unusual. To be honest, I had never seen a strange car there before. That made me uncomfortable since I would have to walk right past it. Inside the car, there was a woman who seemed to be around 35 or 40 years old. She had deep, dark circles under her eyes, and her black hair was completely disheveled. She stared at me directly, but I looked away and kept walking. I could feel her eyes following me as I passed. I quickened my pace until I reached the school. That night, during dinner, I told my parents what had happened, asking who she might be and why she would be there. They were clearly worried, though they tried to appear calm. They suggested that the woman was probably lost and told me not to think too much about it. But I could see the uneasiness in their eyes. For the next week, they started driving me to school, which was unusual since both of them started work before 6 in the morning. They were probably late every day just to take me, which I thought was an overreaction. But I knew they were just being protective. The following Monday, I went back to walking to school. During that week, when my parents had been taking me, there was no sign of the woman or the car, so it seemed like the whole thing had been resolved. However, when I reached the same point on the trail, there she was again, sitting in the same spot, in the same car, watching me. My heart pounded. It was too much of a coincidence for her to appear at that exact spot twice, always when I was alone. Without thinking too much, I decided to leave the trail and cut through the woods. As soon as I took my first steps, I noticed she had realized what I was doing. She started the car and drove forward, stopping even closer. I kept pretending to be calm, but I picked up the pace, going deeper into the trees. That's when I heard the car door open and footsteps crunching through the dry leaves behind me. She called my name, her voice strangely soft and almost affectionate. I glanced back for a moment. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and lifeless, her expression empty. A disturbing sight. I ran as fast as I could. After getting far enough away and losing sight of her, I circled through the forest until I reached home. As soon as I got inside, I called my parents. They contacted the police and immediately returned home. What I could have never imagined was that my parents already knew exactly who that woman was. She had been married to my father almost 20 years ago. Apparently, she had been struggling with severe mental health issues for some time and had alarming episodes where she developed obsessions and acted in strange, frightening ways. The same day I mentioned seeing her, my parents reached out to the police, certain that it was her. The police searched for her, but at the time, found nothing suspicious. Even so, throughout that entire week, she had been lurking around our house, aware that my parents left early for work and that I would be walking to school alone. To this day, my parents have never told me what happened to her after that, nor what her intentions were with me, or what drove her to act that way. I truly hope nothing like that ever happens again. In 2019, I worked at a supermarket, mostly on night shifts, and lived alone in a one-room apartment. The store had its share of regular customers who showed up at almost predictable times. One of them was a man who came twice a week, always just before closing. No one knew his name, but everyone recognized him. He was the type of customer who arrived at the last minute and annoyed the staff. Since I was usually the only one at the register at that time, I was the one who dealt with him. The man had a peculiar demeanor. He spoke little, carried a tired expression, and always seemed distant. One night, as usual, he showed up before closing, bought a few things, paid with minimal interaction, and left. Only a quick good night was exchanged between us. Shortly after, I finished my shift, cleaned up, clocked out at 10:15 p.m., and headed to the parking lot. I noticed he was still there, standing beside his car. The way he stood motionless, his arms hanging loosely by his sides, staring at the store's facade, was unsettling. I got into my car and drove home. The next day, I had the night off and decided to stay up late. I didn't go to bed until after 1 a.m. Just as I settled in, a bright light shone through my bedroom window. I assumed it was a neighbor arriving home and didn't pay much attention. Within seconds, the light disappeared, and I figured it was just headlights. I quickly fell asleep. Sometime later, I woke up startled, thinking my phone was ringing. Still disoriented, I reached for it on my nightstand, but there were no calls or messages. I was about to ignore it and go back to sleep when something caught my attention. The bedroom door was slightly open. That was strange because I always made sure to close it completely before going to bed. I got up, walked to the door, and pushed it to see if there was an issue. It closed normally, fitting into the frame without any trouble. Anxiety began creeping in, even as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. My mind went back to the light I had seen before sleeping. I walked to the window and, through the blinds, saw a car parked in my driveway. Only the rear of the vehicle was visible, but fear took hold of me. Who was there? Could someone be inside the house? I rushed back to the bedroom door and turned on the light. I stood frozen, trying to decide what to do. I figured I should call the police, but when I looked at the nightstand where I had left my phone, I noticed something. A single eye was staring at me through the small gap in my wardrobe door. The shock was instant. My body locked up, and a strangled cry escaped my throat. Without a second thought, I bolted out of the house. It took me about 15 minutes to find a neighbor willing to open their door and call the police. When the officers arrived, the car was still parked in my driveway, but the man was gone. They quickly tracked down the vehicle and, along with it, its owner. My stomach churned as I recognized the supermarket customer. The explanations he gave were incoherent, but it became clear he had been watching me for some time and didn't have good intentions. Thinking about what could have happened still unsettles me to this day. I believe I only woke up that night because his phone rang while he was hiding, and he silenced it at the exact moment I stirred. If not for that, I might not even be here to tell this story. Good evening, Dom. I hope you can share my experience with your subscribers because I believe it deserves to be known. It was the first time my wife and I went through something out of the ordinary. About 2 years ago, right after we got married, we decided to take a trip to a coastal city. I'll just say it was in Colombia. My wife found a beautiful reasonably priced apartment for us to rent during our vacation using one of those online platforms. When we arrived, everything seemed perfect. The place was charming, with a breathtaking view and a small but delightful pool. Also, our hostess was extremely attentive from the start, welcoming us kindly and answering all our questions about the area. During the day, everything was peaceful, with no sign of what was to come. The issue began on our first night. My wife has trouble sleeping, so while I quickly dozed off, she stayed up reading a book to try to relax. Around 2 a.m, she woke me up, saying she had heard a strange sound coming from the patio where the pool was. In the bedroom, there was a glass door that led directly to the outdoor area, giving a full view of the patio. She got up to check, but didn't see anything unusual and went back to her reading. A short while later, the same noise happened again, and she was sure it sounded like someone getting into the pool. She got up to look once more, but again saw no one. Already uneasy, she decided to wake me up again, sensing something was off. I asked her to stay in the bedroom while I went downstairs to check. Carefully, I went out to the patio and opened the door, but there was no sign of anyone. I reassured her, suggesting it might have been a cat or some other animal, and then returned to bed. It wasn't long before a loud noise from downstairs woke me. Before I could say anything, my wife spoke in that warning tone. "Now, do you believe me?" This time, there was no denying it. I got up and went to the bedroom's glass door. I could see the pool water churning as if someone had just gotten out of it. The scene was strange, especially since the weather was completely calm, with no wind to account for the movement of the water. My wife, now quite frightened, insisted I not go downstairs again. She decided to message the hostess, explaining what was happening. However, it was already late, and we got no reply. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, but after that incident, we heard nothing else. The next day, when we checked the phone, there was a message from the hostess apologizing for not responding sooner. She explained that she takes strong sleeping medication and hadn't noticed the notifications. Later, the hostess came by the apartment. She seemed genuinely embarrassed and apologized for what had happened. She said she had reviewed the security camera footage but hadn't found anything out of the ordinary. Her reaction was so sincere that we ended up feeling sorry for her. We suggested it might have been just an animal, though deep down we still found it puzzling. The day went by peacefully. We spent our time exploring the city, walking its streets, and visiting the main tourist spots. We returned to the apartment exhausted a bit before midnight. My wife went straight to shower, while I stayed in bed on my phone. That's when the same strange noises started again from downstairs. I decided to check immediately, hoping to finally discover who or what was causing them. When I looked out at the patio, I saw the pool water moving as if someone had just left it. Without saying a word to my wife, I went down to the first floor. As I approached the glass door, I noticed something that made my heart race. Small handprints on the glass and water dripping down as if someone wet had touched it. The most unsettling detail was that the prints seemed to belong to a child. I hurried back upstairs, my fear evident. My wife, already in bed, asked what had happened. I couldn't hide it and told her everything. She insisted on going down with me to check. When we got there, the prints were still on the glass. Turning on the outside light, we noticed that the patio floor was also wet, with water trails leading from the pool to the door. That was when I felt something was wrong, something dangerous. We searched every corner of the place, but found no one. Frightened, my wife called the hostess again, and this time she answered promptly and arrived at the apartment within a few minutes. Visibly uncomfortable, she showed us the camera footage on her phone. In the video, the pool water could be seen moving, but most frightening of all was seeing the handprints appear on the glass with no one around in a completely inexplicable way. That was when she revealed something we would never forget. Through tears, she told us she had lived there with her husband and their 5-year-old daughter. One day, while making lunch in the kitchen, the girl was playing on the patio. Tragically, the child fell into the pool. By the time the mother noticed, it was already too late. The little girl had drowned. The hostess, clearly shaken, apologized multiple times and offered to refund the remaining nights if we wanted to leave the apartment. We didn't know what to say. The hostess's pain was evident, and her story left us deeply moved and terrified at the same time. Although we declined the refund out of empathy and respect for her situation, we decided we couldn't spend another night there. We packed up and left that very night, certain that this experience would remain etched in our memories forever.